Alrighty. There we go. So Matt, are you seeing my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So as always, I'm going to be recording the notes that we're going over today. And if you want to go back and watch them on your own later, review some things I talked about that you might have missed, I'm going to post it up in the Zoom class videos under our October 6th section on the excretory system. So that is the official name of the body system that we are going to be covering this week, the excretory system. So we are in week 6, like I said at this point, so we got to scroll all the way down here to our excretory system notes, our notes for Tuesday, October 6th. All right, so the excretory system, which is all about filtering out toxins and excess material and waste from our blood and getting rid of it through the passing of urine. So the excretory system is also sometimes called the urinary system. This is the process by which urine is made and by which we pass a whole bunch of waste and other non-essential particles out of our body, saying we don't need you anymore, time to leave. So we're getting rid of the waste in our body and our blood, especially through the production of urine. So there are a whole bunch of different pieces that go into making urine. We're not going to talk about all of them over the course of the next couple of days, but we'll talk about a couple of the most important ones. And most importantly, we're going to be going through the steps that our excretory system puts our body and our blood through in order to make sure that we're getting rid of waste. And so we're really going to be focusing on the kidneys. These guys are going to be the major central organ of the excretory system. They are what is actually doing all of the filtering and removing that we're going to be talking about today. And then our kidneys are attached through these tubes to your bladder down here, right in your pelvis. And then the urethra is the little tube that goes from the inside of your body and carries the urine to the outside of your body. So the kidney, again, is our major organ. This is the spotlight piece of our excretory system. And so there's kind of 3 basic things that kidneys are doing in order to maintain what's called homeostasis, which is essentially just a fancy science word for keeping everything inside your body at the correct level, nice and balanced. So when your body is in homeostasis, that means your blood has the correct amount of blood cells and water and nutrients and oxygen all flowing around through it. So over time, waste builds up in our blood. All of our cells are doing all of these different chemical reactions that produce waste. And so we need to remove that waste from the blood. We don't want it to build up too much because that can cause all sorts of problems. Kidneys help us maintain things in our blood like electrolytes, fluids, especially water, pH, so making sure that our blood doesn't get to be too acidic or too basic, but falls in a certain pH range. So this really goes into that homeostasis that we were talking about, making sure that everything is maintained, everything stays at the correct level. Kidneys also play a role in hormone production. So there's 2 little glands on the side of your kidneys called the adrenal glands. We're not really going to talk about them because they don't really play a role in the excretory system, but they are where things like adrenaline and epinephrine is produced from. So those glands make some hormones. Kidneys mainly remove waste from blood and then make sure that that blood has the correct balances of things like water and electrolytes. So, as you may be aware, we don't just have one kidney. Unlike a lot of the other organs in our body, we've got two kidneys. So your kidney is located fairly dorsally, meaning close to the back of your body, or close by your spine. And they're located like right above your hips. So these little white marks here show where the hip bones are at. You can see your hips are right here. So the kidneys are just above your hips on sort of the back side of your body. So we have two kidneys, although a human body can function all right with just one kidney. That's why when you hear stories about people donating their kidney to somebody who needs it, usually somebody who's related to them or a close friend, they can do that because one kidney is able to filter all the blood in your body effectively enough to keep you working. But we have two of them to kind of share the load, and in case something should happen to one, we have a second one. So all of the blood in your body passes through your kidneys about every 30 to 45 minutes. So your kidneys do a complete clean sweep of your blood every minute. So there's a lot of blood that's flowing through the kidneys. It comes in through special arteries called the renal arteries, and then it leaves and goes back towards your heart through your renal veins. So the kidneys are connected to these tubes called ureters. That's what these guys are on either side here, these little tubes. And those are what carry the waste that the kidneys take out of your blood down into the bladder underneath. And so the bladder, as most of you are probably aware, is right in your hip bones, and it's connected to the little tube, the urethra, that carries the urine out of your body. So today we're really going to focus in on the kidney, its different parts, and do sort of a general overview of how it filters our blood. So kidneys have kind of this funky bean shape, hence the name of kidney beans. They are shaped pretty close to what your kidneys look like, although your kidneys are a little bit bigger. So kidneys have two layers. We have the outer cortex layer, so like this light pink color around the outside here, that is the cortex layer. So like all this right around here is the cortex. And then the inner layer is called the medulla. So that would be like where you see sort of these little stripy guys. This is the medulla right in here. So the cortex around the outside and the medulla on the more inner side of the kidney.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Is medulla a shape? Because I noticed it's in a lot of different parts of the body.
No, not exactly. Honestly, I don't know exactly what it's referring to because I know there's the medulla oblongata that's up in your brain. So I've actually never looked into what exactly medulla means. I just know that certain things have that name for different areas.
Just curious, no big deal.
Good question, though. All right. So inside of your kidneys, the actual little sections that are doing the filtering are called nephrons. And we're going to talk a lot about nephrons today. You can't see them in this picture right here because nephrons are very, very small. There are hundreds of them that go throughout the cortex and the medulla. So don't worry about the nephrons. We're going to talk a whole lot about them today and a whole lot about them on Thursday. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the blood that's coming in to get filtered comes in through our renal artery. And then the blood that's already been filtered and is going back to the heart is the renal vein. And then we've got our ureter. That's a little tube that leads out of the kidneys down to our bladder. So cortex going along the outside of the kidney. The medulla is this section on the inside. And then we've got our ureter carrying all the waste that has been filtered out of the blood down into the bladder. So here is what a nephron looks like. I know it's a big, complicated looking structure, but we're going to go through it piece by piece. And like I mentioned, there are hundreds, if not possibly thousands, of nephrons in a single kidney. So that's why they're not on the picture of the kidney that we were just looking at, because they're very, very, very small. You can see these are very small arteries and veins that are coming in and interacting with the nephron. So the nephrons are what is actually cleaning the blood. When the blood comes into this renal artery, you can see that it's being split off into more and more and more and more branches. And all of these different little branches are going into a nephron to get cleaned. So the nephrons are what are taking the waste out of the blood and are balancing the water and the electrolyte levels within the blood itself. And so today we're going to kind of talk in general about what some of these different major sections of the nephron are doing and what they're there for. Before we get too deep into the nephrons, any kidney or nephron related questions so far? Alrighty. So the nephron. So you may have noticed in our picture that we have sort of this top part of the nephron and then these big kind of loops and ducts that go down into the bottom part. The top part of the nephron is in our cortex, but the bottom part, this big loopy thing down here and this big tube over here, they are what extend down into the medulla. So we have hundreds and possibly thousands of these nephrons spanning the cortex and the medulla all the way around the kidney. So here's a little bit kind of more cleared version of a nephron. And so there are a couple major things that we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on this guy called the glomerulus, which is all these little tubes of blood inside this big container. We're going to focus on the Bowman's capsule, which is this big structure around the glomerulus. We're going to focus on the loop of Henle, this big loop going down, being crisscrossed by all these blood vessels. And we're going to focus on the collecting duct, which is what does kind of the final collection of all of the waste and water that we're going to get rid of and takes it out of the kidney to the ureter. So we're going to go through each one of these one by one and talk about kind of some of the basics of what they do and how they function. So as the blood goes into the nephron, into the little glomerulus right here, I've got all this blood coming in. The force of that blood going through that tight little area basically pushes impurities and waste and toxins out of the blood into the nephron itself. And then the purified blood leaves through a little vein called just a venule. But eventually that little vein will link up with that renal vein that's heading out of the kidneys. So there's kind of two different steps to purifying your blood. There's the filtration part where we pull a whole bunch of stuff out of the blood. And then there's a second part of reabsorption, where essentially, usually we pull a little bit too much out of the blood during that filtration part. And so reabsorption is where the nephron makes sure that we put some of maybe the water and nutrients back into the blood that we may have taken too much out of. So the blood comes in, gets filtered out, the water and electrolytes and nutrients get reabsorbed and rebalanced, and then the newly purified blood exits and heads out through the veins to that renal vein. So up first, we have our blood coming into the nephron through the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is all these little tubes of blood inside of the Bowman's capsule. So the capsule is the big thing on the outside, and then the glomerulus is all of the little tangled up blood vessels on the inside. And so essentially what happens is the blood comes in through that artery, and as it goes through the glomerulus, it creates a lot of pressure and causes things like water, amino acids, electrolytes, urea, and other small waste particles to diffuse out of the blood. So we talked about diffusion when we were talking about the gas exchange of the blood in the lungs and the alveoli, where the oxygen in the air is high, so it goes into the blood, whereas the CO2 in the blood is high, so it goes into the air. A similar thing happens here. The blood has all of these different particles in fairly high concentration, whereas the capsule and the nephron itself does not. And so a lot of that stuff will diffuse out of the blood and create a substance called the filtrate. So the filtrate is basically just a word to describe all of the water and urea and electrolytes and other waste products that have been filtered out of the blood and are now traveling through the actual tube of the nephron. So the filtrate continues on through the nephron, whereas now our new blood that has had all this stuff taken out of it exits the glomerulus and continues on. It's not going to go back to the heart quite yet, because remember, we're going to do some reabsorbing of some of our water and electrolytes and stuff like that. But all of our toxins and waste products have been filtered out. And so the blood is going to go along. So the blood and the filtrate are now separately. They're going through two different systems. The blood is continuing on through the arteries and veins, whereas the filtrate is going through the nephron itself. So the nephron in the pictures that we've been going through is all those yellow tubes, whereas the blood is traveling through the arteries and the veins, which are the red and blue tubes. Let me see if they have like a yellowy color. That'll work. So this is sort of a recap of what I was just talking about. We have our glomerulus, all of those little bundled up blood vessels, and the Bowman's capsule, which is like a little cup, the whole bunch of fluid diffuses out of the blood into the capsule, and this creates the filtrate. Right. But other things, so things like blood cells, blood proteins, and platelets, so those things that help clot the blood, they're too big to pass through and diffuse through the capillaries in the glomerulus. They're too big to go through the glomerulus into the capsule. So that's why they stay in the blood, where all of this other stuff leaves to make up the filtrate. So we got the blood coming in. All of this stuff gets pulled out into the filtrate, and we just have the very basics left behind: blood cells, platelets, and some certain proteins. So our blood has been filtered now. We've got our fresh, our super clean blood coming out through this little artery right here, while the filtrate is what's passing through all these little yellowy tubes over here. So the filtrate is what's actually going through the nephron. So you can see that the filtrate, or the nephron, and the bloodstream still keep crisscrossing. And that's because, as you may have noticed, there's a lot of stuff that we'd actually prefer to keep in our blood and not go and be excreted as urine. So we don't want to get rid of all of our water. We don't want to get rid of a whole bunch of glucose or amino acids or vitamins. A lot of that stuff we want to stay in our bloodstream, but it gets pulled out by that filtration. So our nephron and capillaries over here, our little red blood vessels, crisscross each other a whole lot. And so those small particles will start to diffuse back into the bloodstream. So we have a whole bunch of reabsorption going on. Our filtrate is going through all of these little windy tubes over here that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail tomorrow. And a lot of those nutrients and sugars and vitamins that got pulled out of the blood the first time around get reabsorbed back into the blood. So everything that was not reabsorbed during that section then goes down through this big loop that goes down and around here, which is called the loop of Henle. Named that, I'm assuming, because some guy named Henle was probably the one who discovered it. Scientists really like to name stuff after themselves or after the scientist who first found something. Happens all the time. So as our filtrate is going down through this loop, it might still have some water in it that we want to have in our bloodstream. So this loop of Henle is all about reabsorbing water, making sure that we have the right balance of water in our blood versus in our urine. because we need some water in our urine, right? When you go to pee, hopefully it is not just like thick honey that's coming out. If it is, you've got a whole bunch of problems and you should probably see a doctor right away. So there is a good amount of water in our urine. That's what makes it easy to pass through our urinary tract and be excreted. But we want to make sure there's a good balance between urine and water. So as we're going through our loop of Henle, if you've been staying super hydrated, you've been drinking water all the time, you've polished off like 2 to 3 big jugs of water during the course of the day, then what happens when you go to pee? Your water is super clear and maybe a very, very light yellow color. That's because your blood has enough water in it already. You're good on your water consumption. So you end up putting a whole lot of water into your urine, which makes it extra clear because you're just getting rid of extra water that your body doesn't need. On the flip side, if you are a little bit dehydrated, you haven't been drinking a lot of water throughout the day, then your urine may be a very dark yellow color. That's because your body needs that water. So a lot of it is getting reabsorbed into your blood and going back to your body. So there's not a lot of water in your urine. And so all the other waste materials are extra concentrated in there, which gives it that really dark yellow color. So we go through our Henle loop down here. The filtrate goes down and then it goes back up. So it basically gives it 2 chances to make sure that we really have the right balance of water. Then once we're all done with that, we make our way over to the collecting duct. And the collecting duct is where everything that got filtered out of the blood but did not get reabsorbed ends up being excreted. So all of the water and waste products that didn't get absorbed back into the blood go through our collecting duct down here and out of the nephron. And eventually all of the collecting ducts from all the nephrons in your kidney meet up in one central area and connect to the ureter. So all of the water and nutrients and wastes that did not get reabsorbed leave the nephron through the collecting duct and eventually will leave the kidney through the ureter. All right. Any questions about, actually, hold on, before I do that, let me make sure that I'm not jumping too far ahead of myself. Oh, look at that, I was. So basically just a little written summary of what I was saying. Loop of Henle, making sure that we're absorbing all the water that we need to back into our blood, because we don't want to be getting rid of water that our body still needs, right? You just don't want to be throwing water out every time that you have to get rid of a little bit of waste. So we want to make sure we have the correct balance of water and waste in our body and in our urine. So once all that water has finally been correctly reabsorbed, that is when our blood leaves through eventually that renal vein to go back to the circulatory system and back to the heart. And then all of that waste product is gathered up by the collecting duct and travels down to the ureter. All right, so any questions about the nephron or how it gets rid of waste from our blood? even though nobody had a specific question, I'm going to go ahead and kind of run through the basics of what happens one more time, just to make sure everybody is on the same page. So we've got our blood that is full of waste and toxins and glucose and electrolytes and water, comes in from the body and gets pushed through the glomerulus down in here. All of the stuff that gets pushed out of our blood is captured by that Bowman's capsule. And then our newly completely cleaned out blood leaves from there and travels across different areas of the nephron. As all of that waste and water material, known as the filtrate, leaves the Bowman's capsule, it travels through all of these tubes and stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail tomorrow. And as it's traveling through there, our blood is reabsorbing things like sugar, amino acids, vitamins, and water to make sure that even though a whole bunch of stuff got pushed out early on, we're taking back some of the important stuff that we still need. So a whole bunch of reabsorption goes on in here. Finally, our filtrate, after a lot of vitamins and sugars have been reabsorbed, does its final pass through the loop of Henle down here, where we make sure that our water has the correct balance in our blood and in our nephron. So if we're dehydrated, it will pull a lot of water out of the nephron to go back to the body. If we're very hydrated, it will keep a lot of that water in the urine to get rid of. So we go through our loop of Henle. We have now reabsorbed as much water and nutrients as we need to. So that filtrate passes to the collecting duct, where it's going to be removed from the nephron and join up with all of the other wastes from the other hundreds of nephrons in your kidney to head out to the ureter and out of the kidney for good. So speaking of ureters, like I said, all of the collecting ducts dump out their filtrate into the kind of center of the kidney, and it then passes through the ureter. So we leave the kidney for good, and we're traveling through these little tubes. You have two ureters, one for each kidney. And ureters are made of some of that smooth muscle tissue, just like we saw in our organs and our blood vessels. And it also uses peristalsis, which is that kind of waves of muscle contraction, just like we have in our esophagus, in our stomach, and our intestines. Similar thing goes on here to make sure that the urine gets pushed down into the bladder down here. So the ureters are pretty small tubes. And so in order to make sure that all of the urine is getting pushed down, they use this peristalsis to kind of gently push all of the water and waste materials that make up our urine down into the bladder. So we have our two ureters leaving our kidney and going down into the bladder. So eventually, obviously, your bladder will get full. That's when your nervous system gets, so your bladder will send a signal to your nervous system saying, hey, I am full, I should probably be emptied out soon. And that is what produces the feeling of needing to pee, is your bladder is starting to fill up and sending signals to your brain saying, hey, things are getting a little full around here. We need to empty out so that we can make some more room for the new waste that will be coming down shortly. So your bladder is also surrounded by smooth muscle. So when you go pee, your bladder contracts and squeezes and forces that urine through the urethra, which is the short little tube that carries the urine from your bladder to out into hopefully a toilet, or maybe if you're out camping, onto a nearby tree or rock. All right, so I think that is the, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. So that is sort of the major stuff that I wanted to share with you guys about how nephrons and the excretory system functions to remove waste from our body and make sure we have the right balance of water and other important materials. Anybody have any questions about urine, kidneys, nephrons, bladders, ureters? Any questions about anything that we've talked about so far?
Nope.
All right, cool. So the assignments dealing with the excretory system should hopefully be pretty straightforward, but we'll go ahead and take a quick peek at them. So the one that got posted today, and remember, since you guys came to the Zoom class today, which thank you very much for doing so, by the way, I've got you guys written down as attending. So if you don't get to this assignment until tomorrow, totally fine. But it's a simple worksheet where I have a basic picture of a nephron with some labels on it. And for each label, I want you to do two things. This is important because a lot of people will do the first thing, but forget to do the second thing and lose points. So I want you to label the different labels as you might expect. Tell me what is this thing called and that thing called and this thing over here, what's that called? But I also want you to describe their function. So tell me a little bit about what each one of these different structures do. So I've given you the names of the different structures right here. So all you have to do is attach them to the correct label. But I also want you to describe, and it doesn't have to be a very long description. It could be a short phrase to one sentence that describes a little bit about what that structure does. What is that structure's role in removing waste or balancing levels in our nephron and our kidney? So that is the assignment that got posted today. And then the assignment that's going to be posted tomorrow is even simpler, if you can imagine. We have a picture of a basic kidney right here. And all I want you to do is label the three major structures of the kidney: the cortex, the medulla, and the ureter. Don't even have to describe their function because these guys don't really have a specific function since all of the action happens in the nephron. They're just kind of describe different areas of the kidney that we can look at in terms of where the nephrons are at. And so that is the assignment that is going to be posted tomorrow. And then, like I mentioned on Thursday, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how exactly does that filtering and reabsorbing in the nephron work, and how exactly is urine made? So what are some of the different waste products that end up going into the urea and the urine that is produced by our kidneys? And we'll talk a little bit about how the liver actually helps out the kidneys a little bit with some of the production of waste. So that is what is coming up in this class for today and tomorrow. All right, any final questions about any of the kidney or nephron or worksheet stuff that we talked about for tonight? Awesome. This is what I want.